Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. I'm your host, Eric Worrell, and this is episode 253. And we're going to be focusing on a recent article that's been making its way around the World Wide Web about how poor Americans get exploited by their landlords. I know that's a topic, a title that will catch a lot of attention depending on what side you stand on. It'll be a different type of attention. Probably either way, it leaves people feeling a little angry, whether you're a renter or you're a landlord that feels like you're being, accusations are being tossed your way. But there's some pretty interesting data behind the story, behind the science that was put together doing this investigative report. And we're going to be breaking that down in today's episode and also getting some feedback from the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group about that, and including that in to kind of just see what other landlords think about this and what they're saying. We'll get to that right after this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
So today's episode is going to be based on an article by Richard Florida of citylab.com. The title of the article is How Poor Americans Get Exploited by Their Landlords, published on March 21st, 2019. It says, do the poor pay more for housing? That's the question at the heart and in the title of a detailed paper published in the American Journal of Sociology on the actual housing costs paid by Americans in low-income urban neighborhoods. Its two authors, Princeton's Matthew Desmond, who wrote the award-winning 2016 book Evicted, and MIT's Nathan Wilmers, track the rent burdens and levels of exploitation faced by those living in concentrated poverty. They also uncover the staggeringly high profit margins made by the landlords who own properties in these areas. So, if you're listening to this as an investor, your ears peaked a little bit like, ooh, high profit margins. But that's not what this article is about. It's more so saying how there is a disparity of what's happening as far as the cost of renting in a slum or a Class D property versus the cost of renting in a middle class America, and how the discrepancy between the two is not actually that far apart. As far apart as you would think, at least. You would think it'd be a lot cheaper being in those Class D properties. But I'll read a little bit more on this. It says that Desmond and Wilmers orient their research around the concept and reality of exploitation. Exploitation is something that is usually associated with workers in the workplace. Marx famously theorized that capitalists derived their profits by exploiting the working class. He encapsulated this in his notion of surplus value. Workers are paid for only a fraction of the value they actually generate, and the surplus is in effect handed over to the capitalist. So when there's a lot of surplus generated, the workers do not get that surplus that goes to the capitalists, the people who have started these businesses. So Desmond and Wilmers invoke the definition of exploitation by the brilliant late Marxist sociologist Eric Olin Wright, who updated Marx's theory of class for modern knowledge economies. Wright defined exploitation as occurring when a dominant and more powerful group enriches itself by excluding a less powerful and more subordinate group from a key productive resource like technology, machinery, or land. So Henry George theorized long ago that land was a key nexus, meaning connection, of exploitation. Where Marx saw capitalists, the business owners, making off with the surplus, George saw all the surplus that from workers and capitalists ultimately making its way back to land. This was reflected in the high rents and land prices that were ultimately paid to landowners, real estate developers, and landlords. Not surprising up to this point. I think a lot of us know that people get into real estate because you can make yourself a lot of money in real estate. If you meet somebody who's really, really rich, a lot of times he owns real estate. So it's not surprising. Reading on a little bit further here, it says that it is a mistake, Desmond and Wilmers argue, to see slums as a byproduct of the modern city, run-down areas that occur by accident. Instead, they contend that the slum has long been a prime moneymaker for those who profit from land scarcity, racial segregation, and deferred maintenance. If labor exploitation is understood to be getting paid less than the market value of what one produces, they write, we can extend this definition to the housing market or by operationalizing exploitation as being overcharged relative to the market value of what one purchases, essentially paying more for less. So that last sentence there really sums that up. Basically, what they're saying is the same way that a worker is marginalized because they can produce a ton of value, that value goes to the owners, the capitalists. They're saying that the exploitation in the rental markets happens in these poverty-stricken areas because in the poverty-stricken areas, they are paying a lot more for a lot less when it comes to housing. They define housing exploitation as the amount of rent paid relative to the market value of that housing and measure this exploitation as a ratio of annual rents from rental housing units over their combined property value. So this is kind of interesting. It says that the level of exploitation rises as the ratio of rent to property value grows. So Desmond and Wilmers make use of two key sources of data: a large-scale national survey of rental properties and a detailed set of surveys of renters and rental properties in Milwaukee. Ultimately, they find consistent evidence that the poor, and especially the minority poor, experience the highest rates of housing exploitation. In the most basic formulations, they find that renters in high poverty neighborhoods experience levels of exploitations that are more than double those of renters in neighborhoods with lower levels of poverty. Neighborhoods with a poverty rate of less than 15% have an exploitation rate of 10%. This means that the rents cover 10% of the actual cost of that housing. In other words, the actual cost of the rental housing can be paid off in 10 years. So in areas where the exploitation rate is 10%, it basically means that the actual cost of the rental housing can be paid off in 10 years. So you bought the rental property, you're making mortgage payments on it, but because of those rents and that surplus of income that's coming in, and that's why you got into this business, is to make money, that it can be paid off in 10 years at a 10% exploitation rate. So this is saying that in high poverty neighborhoods, those where 50 to 60% of residents live in poverty, the exploitation rate is 25%, meaning that 25% of the value of the property is paid back in a single year of rent. So that means in 4 years, right, 25% in 4 years, that the value of the property will be paid back in rent. So easy way of saying that is if you bought in these areas, you bought a $100,000 property, you may expect that you're going to get a 25% return each year because of the exploitation rate. So within 4 years, you'd be able to pay that property off. The housing exploitation rate is also higher in majority black neighborhoods, 20 to 25%, compared to minority black neighborhoods, 10 to 15%. These results are backed up by studies, more high-powered statistical models. So I want to take a little bit of a break from reading the article here. I know at this point, most of the listeners, I don't think we have too many renters that listen to this podcast. The discussion goes to, poor renters. What about us, right? What about our needs? What about the fact that we're always vilified, especially in this case, like it's the landlord that is the issue that's driving, that's exploiting the renter, contributing to poverty issues. It's a common response to this question. I did see some of that in the Facebook group as well. Somebody had posted this. I'll give credit to Ilya Kaplan, posted this article in the Facebook group. He also mentioned that he was listening to Rent Prep episode 221, which is about investing in low-income housing with Michelle and Bruce Fisher. So if you are curious about that episode, you can check out episode 221. But I thought that some of the people that responded to this made a very articulate point about what the article is lacking, right? It's focusing on the end issue, but not some of the issues that the landlord faces by investing in these areas. So I'll quote Matthew here. He wrote out a few paragraphs here. So he said he personally doesn't own any D-class assets. However, the article speaks strictly of margins. It doesn't mention a thing about the investment in time to actually run one of these properties, nor the risk associated in doing so. So he kind of goes on to say a little bit more, but he finishes it off by saying that while this paints a bleak picture for owners of poor housing, it doesn't touch on anything in regards to the business risk associated with such ownership. Not the management hassles either. Just remember, there are three sides to the coin. No one ever thinks about the edge. And I thought that was a great way of summing up the article, at least in my opinion, is it is very anti-landlord, especially if you want to use the term slumlord, somebody who's investing in D-class properties and maybe not doing a great, spending a lot of money updating them. It's basically saying that it's a profit center for them. But if everybody knew this, and like, let's say everybody does know this, I don't think that there's still going to be a mad rush for people to buy up these D-class properties for exactly the reasons that Matthew is spelling out. There are more headaches. It's harder to screen. You're going to deal with people not paying rent as often, and you're just going to have to deal with the loss that occurs from that. One thing that I would also be interested in knowing is how deep did the data go in the study? Did they look at the cost of evictions and how many on average are evicted? Did it look at how many tenants on average in Milwaukee have not paid their rent and the landlord lost out on that rent? Did it look into the cost of damages that could potentially happen if people are losing security deposit plus because maybe they had unpaid rent? So it's easy, I think, sometimes to look at, all right, well, here are the rents in the city. Here's what that means. And, for the exploitation ratio that it had. So, okay, it's 25% in 4 years, you're going to have this property paid off. That's in theory if you do get paid every single month for 4 years. But if you lose months, that number is going to go down. I like to really, stretch analogies, but it feels like the stock market, right? So if you're willing to invest in risky stocks, your potential returns are going to be much greater than somebody buying an index fund or somebody who's buying the entire stock market, right? Because your risk is a lot higher. And because of that risk, you're compensated for it. Or you pay dearly for it. You could potentially lose everything. Well, if you're investing in real estate, if you're looking at a Class D property, let's say it's an apartment building versus, a Class B apartment building, the potential returns in that Class D property are going to be a lot higher. And the reason they're going to be higher is that your initial costs are going to be lower. You may not be dealing with a mortgage quite as long, or potentially you could even pay cash due to the lower prices. And you're going to potentially make a lot more money. But if you have a tenant that, doesn't pay rent, like I was mentioning, they're getting evicted or creating a stir, just from a management standpoint alone, like, are you going to have to pay more for a property manager, or are you managing it yourself and dealing with these headaches that are naturally going to come in lower rental situations like this? And I don't want to stereotype, but let's be honest, if you're in a Class D property, you're going to be dealing with issues that you may not be dealing with in Class B properties. Is that true for every single situation? Absolutely not. Is it true across the board on average? Most likely. I can't say because, I don't have access to every single rental property in the United States, but I think that's a sentiment, a story that people share that they can probably agree on, that you're going to have more headaches with a Class D property. So these articles are really tough because I don't question the data that the researchers came up with. You don't get published in the the American Journal of Sociology without just, we did a Facebook poll and this is what we think's happening. Like, they had to do a lot of research to come up with this. But there's always a bias in any research. So when they set out to do this research, I don't think it was to prove that D-class landlords are, good people who are really helping out a situation. It's probably to show the issues that are popping up because of these. So why don't we take a little bit further look into the article here, because there is some more interesting information here. It says with the detailed Milwaukee data that the researchers find an increase of 10 percentage points in neighborhood poverty increases the rate of housing exploitation by more than 2 percentage points overall. Again, that housing exploitation percentage, that 2%, that was when we were talking about, like, it's 25% in very poor neighborhoods, 10% in middle-class neighborhoods. And that it says that 10 percentage point increase in Black residents increasing the housing exploitation rate by nearly 1%. So if you're buying rental properties, and for every 10 percentage points increase in poverty, that you're going to have essentially a 2% more profitable rental property. And for every 10 percentage point increase in Black residents, so the ratio of Black residents, you're also going to see a 1% increase in your profitability of that property. So it says the story doesn't end there. Landlords are making a bundle from poor renters. The poor pay a considerable amount of money in rent. Nationwide, median rents in poor neighborhoods are $511 per month compared to $674 in non-poor neighborhoods. In Milwaukee, the gap is much narrower, $600 in poor areas versus $650 in non-poor areas. When Wilmers and Desmond control for regular expenses in the form of mortgage payments, property taxes, property insurance, utilities, and property management fees, they find the actual profits that landlords make to be significantly higher in poor neighborhoods. Nationally, landlords in poor neighborhoods derive a median profit of $298 monthly. So that's interesting because you can kind of compare that to your own situation on what your profits are on your rental properties. And it said compared with $225 in middle-class neighborhoods and $250 in affluent ones. In Milwaukee, the profit differential is even greater, with landlords in poor neighborhoods raking in $319 per month, more than double the profit, $174 per month, of landlords with properties in non-poor neighborhoods. It's interesting when it's looking at the national averages. Again, poor neighborhoods, $298 profitability per month, middle class, $225, affluent, $250. So it's curious how, if you're in the middle class, nationally speaking, it is the least profitable sector of neighborhoods to buy rental properties in. So it says the same basic pattern holds when expenses including maintenance and repairs are factored in. Across the nation, landlords with units in poor neighborhoods average nearly $100 a month in net profit compared to about $50 in affluent neighborhoods and just $3 in middle-class areas. In Milwaukee, landlords, again, do even better, taking home about $150 per month compared to roughly $20 a month in non-poor neighborhoods. So those are really crazy margins, right? The margins are the reason for this discrepancy is that the rental markets have very different dynamics in expensive cities like New York and San Francisco than less expensive cities like Milwaukee. In low-cost cities, landlord profit rates rise steeply alongside neighborhood poverty. But in expensive cities, the reverse is true. In expensive cities, landlords make money through appreciation and gentrification. In lower-cost, more economically hard-hit cities, they make it on the backs of the poor. So that's interesting too, because I think a lot of times, especially in the Facebook group, we'll see landlords say like, oh, you got to buy like this type of property. You got to buy this type of property. This article is just spelling it out that it's completely reversed depending on what kind of city you're in. So we had Tim Shiner on the podcast. Oh gosh, it's been a bit, but one of his tools, one of his tactics for investing is he buys really expensive Class A properties. And he counts on the appreciation, but he's in Dallas in a really nice neighborhood, so he can do that. So in these very nice, high cost of living cities, you can bank on appreciation being your investment tool, where if you're in a low cost city, one that's has a high poverty rate, people tend to bank on making their money on the rents in poor neighborhoods. If exploitation relies on the exclusion of a disadvantaged group from a productive resource, Desmond and Wilmers write, that resource is housing located outside of poor neighborhoods. Renters in poor neighborhoods are excluded from both home ownership and apartments in middle-class communities on account of their poverty, poor credit, eviction, or conviction history, or race through discrimination. Ultimately, they conclude renters are exposed to exploitation on account of their reliance on housing and their lack of options for securing it. One of the things I was thinking about as I was reading that, though, was I thought it was interesting how hopefully I'm not quoting this article incorrectly, but I thought at one point it said the difference between the poor areas in Milwaukee was $600 versus the non-poor areas was $650. So a skeptical brain might say, well, for $50 more a month, you can live in a nicer neighborhood. But it's not, it's not even an elephant in the room. People know that landlords discriminate, bad landlords discriminate, and that in those situations, maybe those poorer renters, especially if they're African American or a minority, are having trouble getting those rentals in that $650 neighborhood. But even though it's only $50 a month, if you're already having such trouble affording a $600 rental because the floor is so high on the rental market, I can see where you run into issues. A different article that I read said that about 1 in 8 of people who apply for Section 8 actually get approved for it and get a voucher. So that's something to consider too, that it's not like every single person is getting a handout, if that's how you want to look at that program. Wherever you sit on it, I think it's interesting because it's another one of those topics that just, depending on which way you want to face while you're sitting on the fence, you can kind of see it from the other person's point of view. Just the title alone, like, you don't want people to not be able to afford decent housing to live in. But then at the same time, you can look at it from the other side and you can say, hey, like, I worked my butt off for the housing that I live in, or to be a landlord, or, I've rolled my sleeves up on the weekends and I'm doing all these projects and I have never taken a handout. And then all of a sudden you look at the other side and you say, well, why is there such a discrepancy in these exploitation rates? And then you look at it from the landlord's position and you say, well, I'm taking on a lot of risk. There's a ton of risk, even financial risk, potentially being sued or evictions and all that stuff that goes along with a lower class property in many situations. So it's really tough to just be able to take a look at these type of issues and just, be able to just say, oh, I know it's right. This is what they should be doing. I mean, this is an ongoing issue that's been going on for a very long time. To finish up this particular episode, because it's not like I claim to have any kind of answer on this, I thought Julia on the Facebook group here had a great comment. She said, before everyone starts getting all bent out of shape, saying they are so tired of hearing the whining of people being exploited, there are landlords who do exploit low-income renters. If you're not one of them, then don't take it personally. I, hit the little love emoji on that comment because I thought that was great. It was really well said by Julia. There's always going to be people who exploit a situation. And then there's always people who don't. And the moment that we start just stereotyping and casting a wide net over an entire group of people, whether that be low-income housing, landlords who own low-income housing, minorities who live in poverty-stricken areas, I think that's where we start to break down in our thought process and capabilities of generating a more thoughtful response and how to solve a situation, how to create an answer for, or at least a potential idea to an answer on an issue that's ongoing. So whatever happens with this, the future will always tell us as it plays out, but it's an interesting problem with a lot of different perspectives on it, and I thought it was worth discussing on the podcast today. So if you guys have thoughts on it, feel free to join the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. You can find the posts in the group that Ilya Kaplan had posted about this, so you can find that article. You can also find it on the podcast on the website at rentprep.com. And also, if you guys missed it, we are doing a weekly Motivation Monday post now, live post. Me and Mike Sims. Mike's acting as the coach. We're working on having people commit to one thing you want to work on each week. And Mike's going to be your motivation to get it done. And we're going to celebrate all the accomplishments that everyone puts forward each week. So if you're working on a rental property, maybe it's just, fixing something at your house, whatever it might be, you can post it on those weekly Motivation Monday posts that you can find on our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/tenant screening. I believe is the link that will get you there. So until next week, guys, take care. Thanks for listening. And I'll catch you next week. All right.